Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Welcome to Hong Kong Confidential. I'm Jules Hannaford and I'm your host. I'm an Australian woman and I've been living in Hong Kong for many years. I'm a mother, a teacher, an author, and I want to share my wisdom and the wisdom of others with you. Thanks for joining me and I hope you enjoy the show.
From life on a farm in rural Australia, where wide open spaces made a young woman yearn to know what was beyond her country town. She moved to the city, became a mother, and found her dream career which took her across the world. But still, something was missing. In her search for love, she traveled far, trusted deeply. She wanted so badly to find someone that she almost lost herself in the process and learned some hard lessons along the way. Fool Me Twice, a new memoir by Jules Hannaford. Available August 20th on Amazon.
Today I'm here with Sara Tang from the Better in Bed podcast. Hi Sarah, thanks for meeting me today.
Hi, it's so awesome to be here in my house.
Yeah, I know. We're in your house doing a little podcast recording.
I know.
Yeah, and it's great because podcasters are starting to meet each other in Hong Kong and we're forming a little Hong Kong pod squad.
Yeah, a little alliance.
Yeah, it's great, isn't it? We're looking forward to doing a little podcast panel together and then next year a podcast festival. So it's very exciting.
Yeah, very exciting. If anything, I hope it encourages more people from Hong Kong to get into podcasts.
Yeah.
It's been such a rewarding experience for me.
It is so amazingly rewarding, isn't
Yeah.
it? What do you find most rewarding about being a podcaster?
I think it's just opened a lot of opportunities for me, but I also just love it as a medium for storytelling. My podcast episodes on Better in Bed, they're quite long. They're about an hour long.
Yeah,
Yours
same.
about that, right? As well.
Mine vary from 20 minutes would be the shortest to an hour and 25 is the longest.
People actually seem to listen maybe close to all the way through. And when they come and feedback to me and stuff, they're talking about what they found interesting about it. I just feel like the engagement and the depth of the audience has been really amazing. I've been so happy to be on the journey.
Yeah, that's great. I absolutely love your podcast. They're so much fun and they're so fun and they're informative and they really make me laugh.
Yeah.
But there's lots of really great information in them as well.
Yeah.
How did you first get into podcasting?
Okay. I started my podcast last September. That's September 2017. And before that, will you believe I have never, ever listened or even knew what a podcast was. I actually thought podcast. I was like, do you listen to that on an iPod? I was like, do people listen to iPods anymore?
That is so funny. They're obsolete. They're gone.
That will tell you how much I knew before that. The story of how I started Better in Bed was initially I had a vision. And my vision was to really bring more sex positive resources to Hong Kong. And that's because of my background as sort of a sex educator. I used to have my own company selling sex toys, and I knew that there's this hunger that people have for really good resources about sex. And when I closed my business about 3 or 4 years ago, I actually realized that the saddest part about closing my business was not that I would have to do another inventory sheet ever again or a stock take, but more like I would miss interacting with people and talking to them about sex and educating them about things like their body and sexual awareness and stuff like that. I really missed that. And last September, I think I was at a point in my job where I was feeling a little creatively sort of frustrated. So I was like, I'm going to do something that's just completely different from my job. And I thought, okay, I want to do something about sex and about being sex positive. At that time, I initially conceived it. I thought it could be a coaching program because that's also what I do a little bit of as well. I can talk about that later. But I was sitting down with my friend, at the time colleague, Jai, and we were having drinks in this dodgy little Saingpoon bar.
As you do.
As you do. On a Wednesday.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, I really wish that I could do something more sex positive. Hong Kong really needs it. And I told him about this idea I had for a coaching program. I initially had called that Better in Bed. So I said, maybe you want to coach people on how to masturbate better, how to be more aware of their bodies, to maybe learn how to ejaculate if you're a female. I mean, how to have an open relationship. So he then said, this sounds fascinating. Let's make it a podcast. He had serendipitously bought a whole bunch of audio equipment at the time. He's also done some sound engineer stuff before. So he was like the perfect person, actually. So he then became my co-host and the producer of Better in Bed. And he also provides on my podcast a very valuable male perspective and that balance.
That's nice, isn't it? To have both
nice.
Male and female perspective when you're talking about sex. It's good because you might have male and female and other genders listening. So,
exactly.
Yeah, it's good to have both sides of the coin.
It is. And his point of view, I mean, he's not here to represent himself, but for him, it was really important too, because he said, guys, they don't really talk about sex like that. When guys talk about sex, it tends to be more like in sort of a locker room, jokey, bantery. You slept with who last night? Oh, like good job, like high five. That's about it.
Yeah, it's not asking meaningful questions or really digging deeper to find out, how they can improve or, what their likes and dislikes are and things like that.
Exactly. So it's been a very enlightening and rewarding journey for him as well from a male point of view.
How did you decide the topics for your podcast? What sort of things were you thinking about each week when you put it together?
The topics that I initially decided on, those were topics that I knew already from my business of selling sex toys, that I knew that these were the hot topics that people were interested in because I knew they would always ask me questions about it. They will always ask, where is the G-spot? What is squirting? What is it? Is it pee? So I knew that naturally there was a whole bunch of curiosity around these topics. And those were also the topics that I felt credibly able to offer information on. So I started with like maybe about 10 topics that we had planned. But then the rest just kind of organically came through. I'm sure you have this too. So depending on your guest, right?
Absolutely.
Suddenly you meet someone and then they start telling you about their lives. I'm like, you need to be on my podcast and you need to tell that story. And then sometimes I will then shape a topic around them.
Yeah. Why do you think, particularly in Hong Kong, there's a need for discussion about sex and sex education?
Well, because nobody talks about it.
Why is that?
I think that's a huge social taboo that I think goes from like decades, centuries long. Not really sure actually what the real origins of this taboo are, because if anything, actually, if you look in ancient history and the Book of Tao and all of that, the Chinese people were very sexual. This is where Taoism, the Kama Sutra, all of them came from ancient Asia. But it's just today, Asia is just so repressed and there's so much taboo around sex. And I also personally had a very conservative upbringing. I had a very religious upbringing. I would say I am the product of an awful sex education. I knew that it was important to talk about these things. And I created the podcast to be everything that I would want to know when I was growing up and had I had these resources on hand.
Can you give me a bit of information on your background for the listeners so they can understand where you're coming from?
Okay, well, I'm from Singapore. I just grew up in a relatively sort of middle class way, but very Christian. my parents' brand of Christianity was very restrictive and it was also very insular. I was basically not allowed to have any fun, okay? Coupled that with living in Singapore, where you're not really allowed to have any fun, including chew gum and everything. I grew up in a very Christian school because that's where we grew up. Sunday school, I was very involved in church. I had my first boyfriend around 14, and he was also somebody from the church. I think at 14, you're in the throes of puberty, right?
Absolutely.
And your hormones are like raging. The pimples on the forehead are popping. It's all over the place. And me and my then boyfriend, we just could not keep our hands off each other. Like,
did you know anything about
No.
sex or anything about what could happen, or had you had any sex education at school?
I had zero sex education, save the school nurse coming in and showing us a whole bunch of really scary looking pictures
Of sexually transmitted diseases.
of sexually transmitted diseases.
Infections,
Yeah.
we call them today.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm showing my age there.
Yeah, but I think it's more like the results and the effects of, STIs on penises and vulvas.
And that's supposed to frighten you, so you never do it.
I was frightened. I couldn't stop. The nightmares did not stop for a week.
Did you literally have nightmares?
Think about it. It's like, I don't know if I had nightmares, but till this day, they're so visually graphic in my head that I still remember them. I remember just one of them. It was just this deformed looking penis, which had a wart growing out of it. I saw another one with pus coming out of the tip.
Yeah, it's scary for kids, isn't it? Especially when you haven't had
It's
any
so
introduction to
scary.
sex education and a bit
Yeah.
of a lead up to the
Yeah.
STIs.
Yeah.
But do you feel that that's what's happening in Asia as well, in the Chinese culture here, that there's not a lot of sex education in local schools?
Yeah. From what I know, there is very little sex education. Sex education is not mandatory in Hong Kong. The few places that do sex education, people tell me, especially like my Hong Kong friends, they tell me that it's maybe like a class where it's maybe like a 2-hour talk. And usually the teacher is way more embarrassed than the students.
Yes, as a teacher of sex education, you have to be able to not be embarrassed and be able to answer any questions and be open to discussion, to also seem a bit sort of hip and cool.
Yeah.
Which is not easy for everyone when you do teach sex ed.
Yeah. And the minute the students sense that you're uncomfortable, they'll be uncomfortable too. They pick up on that stuff all the time. What's your experience of sex education being
I
here?
think in the international schools in Hong Kong, well, certainly in my school, the sex education program is amazing. Really, really good. Very, very detailed. We look at the whole package, not just the act of sex and all the parts and what's involved physically, but we look at the emotions and we look at the relationships and we look at consent and we look at gender and sexuality, all of that. So I do think that certainly our students, and I believe it's the same in a lot of other international schools as well, I think the sex education programs in many of them, if not all of them, is really, really very good.
Yeah.
But it does come down to having teachers who are really on board and are happy to get out and talk about these issues and let the kids ask questions. And one of the ways that we do it is we get the students to write their questions down and they put them in a box.
Oh,
so that they're not embarrassed to put their hand up and then ask it in front of everybody. I'm always so impressed with the quality of the questions.
Yeah.
You know, they really take it seriously. They ask amazing, very interesting, in-depth, thoughtful questions. And it just shows the thirst for knowledge that young people really do have when it comes to sex education and how they really want to know. It's brilliant. And it'd be great if that could permeate more into the all of Hong Kong school culture and Hong Kong life, which is what you're trying to do with your podcast.
I agree. I don't see that learning about sex should be any different than learning about family or relationships or health or even tying your shoelaces, anything. It should just be a normal part of life because that is what sex is.
Yeah. And I think you've really hit on something with the families and the relationships and the health, because that's all part of sex education as well. It doesn't stand alone. It really fits into all of those other areas.
It is.
It's really important to look at it holistically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Do you have a dream to do something in the sex education field in Hong Kong?
Yeah. I still want to create my coaching program. I think that's in the pipeline once I finish conceiving it and doing my to-do list of 500 other things. I think that's still definitely where it's headed. I definitely want to do more speaking events, and I just want to get the platform out there, and I want to just normalize it as much as possible. I really just, in essence, want to change the conversations that we're having about sexuality. I want to shift it from a position of shame to a position where we're actually celebrating pleasure, because that's really what sex is and what sex should be. And I want to also present a diversity of different viewpoints. That's what I try to do with the podcast as well. I mean, that's why it's very important for me to have different guests on the podcast, because I think everybody brings their own sexual journey and personal experiences to the table. And you'll realize that sex is so diverse. It is like a buffet.
That's a nice way of explaining it. Yeah.
It's a buffet of things that you can choose from. And I always wanted, with the way that I presented sex education, not to be too formal or dry or something that you would learn about in the classroom. So it would be different if, for example, on the podcast, I said, okay, so let me talk to you about sex after kids or gay sex. While I can tell you my experience in terms of all of the insights that I've collected from talking to a lot of people, it doesn't make as big an impact or as personal an impact as having somebody who has had sex after kids sit down in front of you and tell their story about what's challenging for them, what's worked out for them, what's not worked out for them.
And that's so interesting, isn't it? It's really when people share their stories that we can really think about our own stories, think about our own positions and where we stand and how we can perhaps look at things from a different perspective or approach things differently. And that's really cool, isn't it?
Yeah, I love that. I think I learn and I engage through storytelling.
Yeah.
And less through, okay, I'm trying to teach you something here.
What do you think would be some of the extreme diverse approaches that you've had from people on the show? Like what would be two sort of really contrasting approaches or attitudes towards sex or a particular topic?
I think the one episode for me that really challenged me quite a lot and probably represented a viewpoint that, like, even till this day, I'm not sure I can get my head completely around it, even though I loved her perspective, was the episode I did on open relationships. Our guest, who you've also had on this podcast, who is Valentina Tidos.
Yeah.
She's a relationship coach, as you know.
Yeah, she's amazing.
She is amazing. But she was also talking about, from a professional perspective, how to have and how to negotiate and navigate an open relationship. But also she was telling her own personal story of how she landed in an open relationship, what she likes about it, what challenges her about it.
What did you find challenging about wrapping your head around that?
I've been in a semblance of an open relationship before, but there's so many shades of open relationships out there.
Sure.
And her shade of open relationship is polyamory. The idea that you can love more than one person. I think I find it challenging to think about that. I would really like to love just one person.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
And an open relationship is not something I've ever even considered, and I don't think I ever would.
Yeah.
And this is where it just comes down to personal preference.
Yeah.
But I would never, ever judge anybody who chose that pathway.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's hard to get your head around these things, but it doesn't mean that it's not interesting to open your mind and listen to it.
It really opened my mind. For me, I'm open to having different sexual partners in an open relationship and have done so in the past. And in some ways, it's the same logic. The logic is that not one person necessarily will be able to fulfill all of your sexual needs for the rest of your life. And if you want to keep a certain amount of novelty and adventure and be able to fulfill all the sides of yourself, unrealistic sometimes to think that only one person can do that for you. Sexually,
there'd be a whole bunch of people out there going, no, that's not true.
Okay, so
I'm really happy and fulfilled.
Exactly.
And there are.
But that's as open as my mind can probably stretch.
Yeah.
Right? But it's the same logic for polyamory. So it's the same logic in terms of not just one person can fulfill all of your needs in terms of a relationship. You know, that's why you have people who play different roles in your life. And that's why you love different people differently. And that's why you can, for example, they always make the parallel of having a child. You can love your first child, then your second child comes along and you love that second child just as much as well. It's just that your definition of love expands. I think I haven't quite wrapped my head around that yet.
I can totally relate to that as well. I don't think I could, but an interesting concept.
It's an interesting concept.
And it just really shows the diversity of people in this world. And it
Absolutely.
It takes all types. And I think as long as you're in a consenting relationship where it's equal and it's respectful and nobody's getting hurt, then it's up to you, isn't it, to decide what you want and what you don't want. And it's about setting boundaries and communicating your wants and your needs to the person or people in your relationship or relationships.
I think that point's really interesting and very critical. It's about talking about it, because I think most people in relationships, they just assume, right? Monogamy is the model, right? And sexual fidelity with just one person. That's it. If I'm married to you, that's it. They don't talk about it.
Even when it comes down to specific likes and dislikes in bed and what you're doing with your partner, you need to discuss that as well. And sometimes people don't have the courage or they feel too nervous to even bring up what they like and don't like. Their sexual competency or their connection can't grow as quickly as those people that can really communicate. And that communication can be physical or verbal or even psychic.
I agree. I think it's so important to talk about these things. But there's so much fear around talking about things. I think people want to talk about.
Why do you think that is? Why?
I think because of the culture, because sometimes there is the perception that their partner will in some ways punish them for talking about it. Why are you bringing this up? Especially about sex, right?
Yeah.
People hate talking about their sex life.
Yeah. Like if you say, look, there's something I would really like to talk about, or immediately people get defensive and think, oh, I'm not good enough. I haven't done it well enough, or I'm lacking in some way. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's interesting, isn't it? So if people could overcome that sort of feeling threatened or judged, it would be easier to have the conversations.
Yes, that's where this podcast, Better in Bed, comes in handy. Yeah. Sometimes I say, maybe instead of just confronting your partner and saying, we need to talk, which people just
get nervous.
They get so nervous.
Your heart starts to beat and think, oh, what have I done?
I say, why not you guys listen to a podcast together? It can be a podcast or it can be a movie about sex or something that starts the conversation but is not seen as sort of a personal confrontation.
Yeah. Yeah. So then you just start discussing topics rather than being specific about things.
So it's more like, oh, what do you think of porn?
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you agree with what she's saying, what Sarah's saying in Better in Bed? Or you like porn? What do you think? That kind of thing. And it just starts a conversation in a less threatening and less confrontational way.
Yeah, exactly. That's lovely.
People have told me that that's sometimes what they do as well. So they listen.
I was just going to ask, do you have any anecdotal evidence that's working for people?
Yeah. They say that they like to listen to it with their partner. Well, it's entertaining. We try to make every episode kind of fun and accessible. It's kind of like a joy for them to listen together, but also it's just gives them a lot to talk about. And it's an easy channel for them to bring up a topic that might not necessarily come up in the everyday conversation.
Is there anything that you've learned doing this podcast that you didn't know before? Have you been educated by your guests?
I would say that I've learned through people's experiences. I have just a lot more empathy with my guests, especially if their experiences are very different from mine. One of the episodes I did was called The Truth About Sex After Kids. For me personally, I don't have kids. I don't really want kids. And at my age, I don't really think that they're going to pop down my vagina anytime soon.
There's a few steps before that.
Yeah, I know. But I also always had this perception, and I think perhaps it's also because it's colored by some of my friends and the people around me, that once you have kids, like sex just goes out the window. And I really just wanted to find somebody
who would talk about it.
Yeah, who would talk about
I
it.
haven't heard that episode. What did she say? Or was it a he? Look,
It was a she. It was a she.
just
It
jumped
was
to
a
the
she.
assumption that it was a woman. What did she say?
She said that, yes, it's challenging, but it's one of those things like with everything in life, like with fitness or with diet or anything. If you want it to be important, you have to make time for it.
That's what I was thinking. I mean, I have a child. I mean, she's nearly 30. But I think that when you have kids and having sex after children, the tiredness is one. You're absolutely exhausted for most of the time till the kid's about 15. Yeah. And then also finding the time. And if you're both working and you've got commitment and running the kids all over the place, how do you find the time? I don't know if it's necessarily libido drops or attraction drops, but I think it's more about finding the space and the time to have the romance and the intimacy with your partner.
Well, she says 2 of her very practical strategies is first, schedule it. For me, again, I'm speaking from a person with no kids, so I'm thinking, schedule it. Like, schedule sex.
Ding. All of a sudden, you've got to switch it on. Yeah.
I know.
Because for many people, it's got to be completely organic.
Yeah.
It's just got to evolve. But sometimes you don't have that luxury of letting it evolve. It's like, okay.
Exactly.
Kids are in bed. It's Thursday night. Let's go.
Let's go. And sometimes you only have a small window of which to make it happen. And then babysitter comes back and then it's over, right?
So that's interesting. I guess whenever you're talking to somebody who's got a completely different lifestyle or different approach or different viewpoints, that's when you're really going to learn. Yeah. And that's what we do with every guest that we have, isn't it? You know?
And just sort of like an overall observation that I had is probably this observation from all of my guests that how you do sex is how you do life.
Would you call yourself a sexpert?
I would call myself, I mean, yes, but I prefer the term sexplorer.
Oh, that's awesome. Sexplorer. I love it.
In terms of sexpert, I mean, yes, I know a lot about sex. I've been in this industry. I've talked to a lot of people.
Have you done training in this area?
Yes, I have.
What have you done?
Just really quickly, but I'm always learning, right? Even as I said with the podcast, everyone's experience is so different. I'm still eating at the buffet, you know?
Nice.
And
life is one long learning experience, isn't it?
Things are still exciting for me. Like, I think how people approach sex is so wide. And sexuality, sexual orientation, there's so many different kinds and so many different flavors. I actually studied human sexuality when I was at Stanford, so as an undergrad. That was probably my very first exposure to it as a topic.
Which is interesting that you went from a conservative family and a Christian school and a very sort of strict upbringing straight into university studying human sexuality. How was that embraced by your parents?
Oh, no, but I was always a rebel. So, I was the angel child until about 17. I then just turned way the other way.
Okay.
And then I went away. So I was very lucky because I was able to go to university in California. If you take Singapore as one of the most repressed places where I had very religious upbringing, to going to one of the most liberal places in the world. And I was just like a kid in the candy store. And I remember that my dorm mates in my freshman year, they saw me, this little innocent Singaporean, and they're like, have you ever made out with another girl? I'm like, no. Have you ever smoked any weed? I'm like, no. I was like, have you been to a strip club? No.
That's hilarious. Oh my God.
I think they took it on themselves to
educate you.
I had all these experiences. Yeah.
Oh, that's brilliant. And then, so after studying human sexuality, what did you do then?
Then I went back to Singapore and I actually started a sex blog. And at that time, it was one of the only sex blogs. I mean, that must have been ages ago. That was like 15 years ago. That was a long time ago since I've been in university.
Well, that's right in the beginning of blogging, isn't it?
Yeah, right in the beginning of blogging. So it got a lot of attention, and especially because it was in Singapore. You know, it was an Asian blogger. And, you know, I was just, at that point, I had broken up with one of my boyfriends, and I was just, the floodgates were open.
Like, look out, well.
Exactly. I was just experimenting. I had just come back from California. So I was on the rampage and I wrote in scintillating detail, like
all the listeners are going to be like searching for your blog
about
now.
all of my exploits. It was anonymous at the time, but it gained popularity really quickly and people were reading from all over the world. And I think as a result of that blog, what happened was a lot of people started contacting me and I became friends with a lot of people that maybe you wouldn't naturally be friends with in Singapore. So I had gay friends, transgender friends, friends who were like erotic dancers, who were escorts, pro-doms, just people who really love sex and who were sex positive, who didn't have the same taboo. So I just started hanging out with a lot of them. And through that, I started to find out a lot more about what they did. And some of the times would be curious enough and they would let me come along and accompany them on some of their sessions. So I would be like, okay. It opened up a whole new world for me. So I learned through that as well.
Really experiential learning.
Experiential learning. But then when I came to Hong Kong, I had a very, very important mentor and she's still a mentor to me to this day. So I met a sexologist and she was studying for her PhD here in Hong Kong. And she also let me accompany her on a lot of her sessions. We became really good friends. And she was probably like the first one who showed me as well that sex can be a career, but more from a professional sort of sex education point of view.
Yeah.
And the way that she worked with clients, I learned a lot from that because she was talking to people about what their common issues were and how it impacted their behavior.
And would you sit in on these sessions?
Sometimes.
Oh,
yeah.
wow. So
Sometimes.
that would have been incredibly educational.
Very instructive for me as well. So I really understood as well what people were struggling with. And she used to do parties as well for women. I would help her with those as well. And from that, I started my own business selling sex toys. So I have, again, like a real depth of knowledge about toys. But the way that I set up that business was all about educating women through workshops and parties about sex. And then sex toys were just part of the game.
When you have a party where you're educating women about sex, you're showing different toys and how they might be able to stimulate them and add pleasure to their erotic encounters.
Yeah.
But are you also just answering questions about, do they just put it out there and say, what about this? And can you answer this question?
Yeah. What I do is I created sort of these very intimate spaces for women so that with their friends, often there'd be like at least about 10, sometimes even larger, 20 of them. We'd start off with like a fun little game. Like I'd say, okay, what's one thing that turns you on? And we'd have to go around the room and it could be anything from
someone nibbling on your ear to watching porn or whatever.
Pitt to, more like kinky fare. So from there, I already sort of broke the ice and made it okay and made it a safe space for people to share.
And when people laugh and when they're more comfortable, then they feel more open.
Exactly.
And certainly when there's an air of no judgment, then people are really able to ask for help and stuff.
Exactly.
And do people write to you or email you with questions or with wanting help?
When we did the live show, which was on March the 8th, do you remember we did this live
and
podcast?
I couldn't believe how many people you had come to that.
80, 90 people, that was on International Women's Day as well. So loads of women came out to support the event. And we did that show purely from crowdsourced material.
You crowdsourced all the questions and then you just answered them.
We had like a series of questions. Like we had people tell us their stories. First thing was, what's the most awkward thing that's ever happened to you in the bedroom? And we got some amazing stories from there. And the whole point was to talk about it and to say it's normal. Everybody has these awkward moments, and we can laugh about it. And that's exactly what you're saying. So we read out some of the worst ones, which typically involve sort of like fanny farting and all kinds of like different bodily functions. Parents walking in, also another big theme for awkward moments. But then we also had like, what's the burning bedroom question that you've always wanted to ask?
Oh, cool. What were some of the cool questions that you got there? Can you remember any?
Yeah. Okay. For all those people who are listening, if you really want to know
all of them,
you have to listen to the Better in Bed podcast because we will be releasing it as an episode. We got a lot of questions on, surprisingly, anal Anal
Oh,
play, anal sex. Yeah, I don't know. Is it surprisingly or unsurprisingly?
Maybe surprisingly, given how you felt the culture here was quite conservative, perhaps.
Yeah, but I think people are curious about it. And also, incidentally, we got quite a few awkward stories about anal play going wrong.
I'm sure. But that's the thing. Anything can go wrong, can't it? You know, you've got to be able to laugh at yourself and try not to panic. And again, communicate how you're feeling and what you want, what you like, what you don't like, when it's time to stop.
Yeah.
And I think that's important too, isn't it? Have you ever done an episode on consent?
No, we haven't.
Okay. That'd be a cool topic because it's such a current topic and it's very important in sex education programs in school.
I would love to. But I think my angle towards it, because look, there's so much discussion around consent right now.
Yes.
And to be honest, some of it is a bit confused. And
can you elaborate? What do you mean?
I mean, I think there's a lot of blaming and shaming.
Mm-hmm. Are you talking about the Me Too campaign?
And I'm talking about the Me Too campaign.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think it's necessary in some ways because I feel like it's a sort of a mass catharsis for women, right? Because women who have been so quiet about this for so long, finally they're all coming out in
it's
droves.
a real empowerment movement.
And I'm absolutely behind that. But then I feel that we've had that now. And we now need to move on to the stage where we need to articulate some positive and clear boundaries and guidelines. And we need to educate our kids, our teens, you know, from a young age, even adults, on what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. And I'm not quite sure we've gotten to that next stage yet, where we are defining the real rules of consent. I think we're still emerging from the catharsis stage. I would love to do one about consent, but I really would love to do one about how to make consent sexy. Because for me, the way people talk about consent now, it's like, okay, I've got this checklist of all the stuff that you have to do.
Let's sign on this dotted line to say that you agree.
Exactly. Hard limit, soft limit, you know.
Can you do a podcast on how to make putting on a condom sexy too?
I really want to do that too. How to make safe sex sexy.
Yes, not like an interruption to it, but make it part of it. I think that's something that people could, a skill that would be really useful to people.
So useful.
Is this a question that comes up or not really?
I haven't had it recently, but I know it's an issue.
Yeah.
And I know everybody knows that condoms and safe sex, I think everyone knows that they should be protecting themselves.
Yes. And it's so important. It really is.
But
and it's hard to do sometimes.
What's stopping them from doing it? Exactly.
Well, because it's not sexy. Hang on a minute. Turn on the light.
Sexy.
You know, stop.
It's not spontaneous.
Yeah.
It's not built into the foreplay.
And it can be, though.
It can be.
Absolutely.
I want to talk about that. And same thing with consent. Consent can be built into your foreplay. Consent is really all about communicating desire. Now, you could do that in a sexy, dirty talk way to say, I'm up for this tonight and this, you know.
Yeah. I love the way the tone of your voice changed then. You're very good at that. Yeah, you could. Or it can be even just communicated physically by the way that the body language and the facial expression and the way that you are fluttering your eyes or playing with your hair or whatever.
Yeah. On the decibel meter, the moan meter.
Yeah, the moan meter. I love that too. But now with this Me Too movement, that's not enough for some people. You know, that nonverbal communication is not enough at the moment. And people need to get a little bit more to be safe. And, you know, whether that will continue for a long time and that's the way sex will go for the future, we don't know. Or maybe this is a phase that will pass. I don't know.
I'm hoping it's a phase.
I mean, I say to my students that if you haven't had a conversation about how you feel about that person, whether you're ready, what sort of, who's going to supply the condom, where you're going to do it, what your relationship looks like, then you're not ready. And of course, there is obviously, as adults, people do it in a much more anonymous way or more quickly. But I think for young people, as they're being educated, that's part of understanding forming relationships and the fact that sex is not just a sport, although it can be for some. But, you know, for many people, it's a real intimate act where there's so many layers to it. So interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think we need to not forget about that aspect of sex. I think one of the things that I constantly emphasize with the podcast is that sex is it's not meant to be goal oriented. And it's not just a physical act.
It's a mental, emotional, physical. It's all of that. And that's when it's at its best.
Yes, that's the best sex. The best sex transcends the physical. I feel it is something that moves you, it's something where either, you feel just such a deep sense of connection with the other person, or maybe existentially it reaffirms a part of yourself or your identity. That first sex after a bad breakup, it's like, yes, I'm back. That's the sort of sex that you want to be having, like stuff which is almost like transcendent, that isn't just, oh, here's, a penis and a vagina and they happen to meet one night.
Yeah. Yeah. If you're heterosexual.
Exactly.
If you're gay, it'll be different.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think that's another thing that really needs to be in sex education in schools is that recognition of different genders and different relationships.
Yes.
It shouldn't just be heteronormative.
Absolutely.
And that's so important because it disenfranchises a small number of kids in the class that feel like they're gender fluid or they're gay or bisexual or asexual, or they don't know. A lot of kids have got no clue what they are, and that we've got to acknowledge that as well. And
absolutely.
And let them know that that's okay. When you're ready, you'll know.
And I think as well, gender fluidity, but also sexual orientation and the fluidity amongst that as well.
Yes, and only you can label yourself. You can't be labeled by anybody else.
Yeah.
It's up to you to decide where you fit on that sexuality continuum and where you fit on that gender continuum.
Yeah.
They're completely unrelated as well.
Very
I think
unrelated.
that's really an important point.
Yeah. I think for us, it's a good reminder because Jai and I have actually talked about this topic as well, because I think sometimes on the podcast, we just revert back to...
Well, you revert back to what you know.
What you know.
Yeah.
And sometimes we need a reminder. And I think as the podcast went on, we had this conversation. We're like, we're very straight on that podcast. And, neither Jai or I are that straight anyway. We're definitely somewhere on the continuum.
But
you just revert to...
Because it's a social norm, isn't it?
Exactly, yeah.
I'm so hoping that evolves and changes quickly so it doesn't become the go-to social norm and everything is just more accepted. It's so important. I mean, I'm straight. My brother's gay and all my students know it.
Yeah.
But I'm so conscious of making sure that I talk about all of these things from the different perspectives and involve everybody as much as possible so that nobody feels left out. And I think that's really important for a sex educator to do.
Definitely on the podcast, we've had one of our upcoming episodes hasn't been released yet, is about gay sex. I've been looking for someone who's transgender for a long time to come on, but haven't quite figured out who yet. But I think that would be, again, fascinating.
It's so important to have a cross-representation of everybody in our community. Me too, as well.
Absolutely,
on my podcast, I want people from all walks of life.
I think you're very good representing very diverse people. I never know who I'm going to hear on your podcast, from week to week.
I feel like I'm getting a little bit pigeonholed into mental health and LGBTQ. So I just did an interview with a shark expert the other day. So.
Good. Yeah.
And I've got some great interviews on very diverse topics coming up.
Yeah.
Not that there's a bad thing to be talking about mental health issues and the LGBTQ plus community, but I want to look at a real cross-section of topics and interview all sorts of different people. Yeah. It's really important.
I love that because I think Hong Kong is so rich with different perspectives and viewpoints. And that's what I'm finding as part of the podcast as well. They're just sort of hidden away. They're just in pocket because no one's really given all these people a platform. And I feel that they haven't all been put up in the spotlight. But
no, people are so willing to talk.
But they're there. They're there. And I love it.
And people are so willing to open up and share their secrets and share their stories. And they're being listened to by hundreds of people out there. And it's just so rewarding, isn't it?
I think it's fabulous. I also think part of the podcast is giving Hong Kongers a voice because I'm proud of this city.
Oh, me too.
And I'm proud of the diversity that it represents and the people that are here. I know that people have told me that they're proud that my podcast is a Hong Kong Kong homegrown podcast because they're like, wow, it's really unique. It's unusual. Nobody else has a sex podcast, and all of the sex media that they're used to seeing are things, they're all Western, right? They're Sex in the City, they're Californication. It's all Western. And for a sex podcast to be produced and to be homegrown in Hong Kong, like people really identify with that. And I try to make Hong Kong as well play quite a big role in my podcast. I mean, while we have like sort of local and international guests, and I think the topic has universal appeal, I try to make sure that there's a lot of context to what we're saying.
I do too. Yeah.
So I think we talk about Hong Kong.
And that brings me to another question that I had about Hong Kong families. It must be very hard for people to have sex sometimes because many people live in very small places with many generations of families. Have you had any discussion or done any podcasts on this topic?
Yeah. Podcast episode number 9, which was Why Asians Don't Talk About Sex. That was an interview with, I think, quite a prominent media and radio personality, Alison Howe. And she specifically was talking about her experiences growing up in Hong Kong. And she said that that's one of the real issues in Hong Kong, privacy. When she first started having sex, like you just can't find a space.
And that's why love hotels are very popular in Hong Kong. Yeah. And I don't know if, I'm not really
I've done that in Singapore too.
Oh, right.
In Singapore too.
Are love hotels common in Western culture? They're not so much, are they? Compared to Asian culture. And a love hotel, for people who aren't really aware, is where you go and you just sort of pay by the hour, don't you?
Yeah.
Yeah, or the 2 hours.
Yeah.
That, I think, is a way that a lot of young Hong Kong couples who live with their parents and their grandparents and sometimes their great-grandparents, because the longevity of life in Hong Kong is so high because everyone's so healthy, and I don't know why that is. Yeah. So I think that's a common way, isn't it?
Yeah.
What else?
I mean, I think the other option is just sort of sneaking around and being very quiet.
But then you don't get to have the full expression and the full enjoyment of the event because you have to do it in silence.
Yeah, I think people still do it, but I think they know that the parents are just a wall away kind of thing. Right. It does sort of take away from the enjoyment, though, if you ask me.
Do you have a specific story of anybody who has come to you and said how you've actually really helped them and that their lives have changed because of your podcast?
For my podcast, no. I mean, I get comments and reviews all the time on the podcast where people tell me they've learned something, that they find it really hilarious. I mean, I like the idea that people are listening and it's entertaining for them on their way to work and stuff. They say like they listen to it several times.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, which is really like such a great compliment. But I do have a specific story.
Yeah.
It is a story that happened when I was selling sex toys. I'll tell you that story. And it's actually a very close friend of mine. I'd been selling sex toys for maybe like a year or two by then. And she came to me in private and she said, do you mind if I come over and look at some of the toys? I also want to have a chat with you. She came over and she told me, I wanted to tell you that I've never had an orgasm ever. And she's had plenty of boyfriends and stuff like that. I was just so surprised because I belong to a group of friends that is quite open. And, I guess because I'm quite open anyway. So, we're talking about sex all the time and everyone knows that I have a sex toy business. But I guess even for her, she felt ashamed to even tell anybody. And finally, I think she told me only a year or two for me selling sex toys. But this was maybe after about 5 years of when I knew her. I sat her down and I said, okay, you need to tell me how you normally have orgasms. Are you touching yourself? And are you having orgasms when you touch yourself? Or are you having any kind of pleasure at all? And then she told me, I don't touch myself, right? I don't masturbate. I was like, aha. So
that's what you need to do.
Start there. And so I remember I sold her a book called I Heart Female Orgasms. And I think if anyone wants to have an orgasm, maybe hasn't had an orgasm before, that's a great book. And I sold her a sex toy, very cheap sort of vibrator, something. It's like $200. And then I didn't hear from her. I mean, I heard from her as in like, I saw her all the time, but she didn't tell me
whether she'd been successful or not.
Yeah. So, and I didn't probe because I think clearly it was very personal for her. About 3 months later, she came back and she gave me a call and she said, I had my first ever orgasm.
Oh, that's great.
And She said it was crazy. It was nuts. She said, I've had several orgasms since then, but they're nowhere as strong as the first one that I had. She said the first one that I had, it was like my whole body was like electrified. Like I just felt it from like my head to my toe. I couldn't stop shaking for like a good 10 minutes. She's like, so I've had a few since then. My question is now, how do I have orgasms like the first one?
It will happen again when the time is right. Yeah, be relaxed. But yeah, I mean, it is an issue. Many women do struggle to have orgasms. And I think, you know, masturbation and exploration of your own body and what you like is the first step. And then being relaxed and not feeling guilty or uptight or that it's wrong or that you shouldn't be doing it or there's something bad about it. You know,
and
that's so important.
not putting pressure on yourself to be like, I must have an orgasm. I said, it's about pleasure. It's not about the goal. It's about enjoying the journey. So it's more about understanding how your body responds. I think what was also key in the book was helping her to understand her body better. And I think that's another thing that I feel a lot of people in Hong Kong sometimes, especially for women, I think they lack a lot of knowledge and awareness about their bodies.
Is that because lack of conversation as they're growing up or lack of education at school or a bit of both?
Yeah, I think a bit of both.
Yeah.
I think, you know, I still used to get questions even during the sex toy parties. Oh, okay. So you use your sex toy. That's in the same hole as the hole that you used to pee, right?
All right. So they didn't really even know that there were different holes. Yeah.
I mean, that's a pretty basic question.
But, you know, it's great they felt comfortable enough to ask that. Yeah. That's the beauty of it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So a lot of the times I actually have this vulva puppet that I would use as a device. I'm like searching around on my couch to see if it's there.
Looking for it.
It's here.
Oh my God. I wish we could have some visuals. Oh my God.
Is
that's really
what
cool.
I used to use.
So initially, as you're pulling it out of the bag, it looks like a little red cushion with gold lips and a little hood.
It actually has lips because it's a puppet, so it can actually talk. You can put your
that's great.
So you can put your hands in and it can talk to you. You can actually use it to explain the clitoris, the clit hood, like the labia, sort of where the vagina was. Yeah. And the urethra. It's really non-threatening, especially when they see its actual puppet where the lips move. I've had lots of people.
So helpful.
Yeah. Lots of people take photos of him.
Yeah.
And I have this puppet on my couch.
It's called for the listeners out there who want to get one, it's called a wondrous vulva puppet. Yeah. That's so cool. I'm so impressed. I love that. And it's really cute.
It is really cute. It's
very
so
cute. It makes the vagina look lovely.
It's so pretty, actually.
It's really pretty.
Yeah. So I used to use that a lot. And I would really educate women on where things were. And
because a lot of women don't get down and have a look, do they? Which is really another good idea. Have a little look and see what's down there.
Have a look.
Yeah.
I think also because anatomically things for women are just sort of hidden away.
Boys can look at their penis every day, and they do. And they handle it, they touch it, they look at it. But for girls, it is all hidden away.
Yeah.
And again, I think there's some stigma with getting a mirror and having a look. But it is a really wise idea to know what's going on down there. And that's going to help you when you want to achieve orgasm or just feel more comfortable with your body.
Yeah. Agree. And just treat it like any other part of your body. You look in the mirror every day and do your hair and do your makeup. You could look at your vulva every day too.
How important do you think it is for people to use the correct anatomical names for the penis and the vagina and the vulva?
Super important.
Why do you think that is?
Because I think that it destigmatizes those parts and it makes it seem, why should I call my hand a wawa? I don't know. It's just my hand.
Yeah. And it's just your vagina.
It's just your vagina. Exactly.
Yeah.
I think from a young age, you want to send the right signals to kids that these are legitimate parts of your body that are no different from the rest of your body.
Yeah, and I just did a podcast with Rebecca Hopkins called Own Your Story, and she talked about body safety and how important it is to have use the correct anatomical names with children from a really young age. So that helps to protect them as well.
Yeah.
It helps them to feel more comfortable with their body and know more about what's right and what's wrong. And
Yeah.
she goes on to talk about permission-based touch and stuff like that.
Yeah.
That's really interesting as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the worst is when they do the slang for the parts. Do you know that? Like in Cantonese, they have slang and it tends to be...
Is it derogatory?
It's not so much derogatory, more like cute and infantile.
But we have that in Western culture
Yeah.
too, like the vajayjay, and people call you, what are some other names? I've usually just called it a vagina.
Yeah, well, in Cantonese, like for the vagina and the vulva, I've heard that the slang for that is abalone. It's the same word.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I was like, abalone?
Yeah, that's because the abalone sort
I
of
was like,
looks
do you
like
think
a
it
little
looks
bit like a vulva, doesn't it?
That's what people told me, like, because it's meant to look like abalone. And I'm like, well, I think abalone is great
Cool,
because
yeah.
abalone is really expensive and it's a delicacy, and that's how it should be treated. That's how it should
Exactly. Put the right spin on it. Yeah.
But you have like little bird for penis and stuff like that. Yeah.
In Cantonese?
Yeah.
Oh,
Even in
that's
Mandarin
interesting.
and stuff.
See, Willy, or, I wish I'd given this more thought before I came to all the, there's loads in every culture though. I'm sure every culture's got their own little pet names for it, but I think that does come down to people not feeling that comfortable using the correct anatomical terms.
Yeah.
That's a shame.
I think the worst is to have no name for it because then it's almost like that part of your body doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's probably the worst if you don't even name it.
Are you a sex therapist? Are you hoping to become one day? Or are you going to become a sex coach?
I wouldn't rule out being a sex therapist, but I like to refer to myself as more of a coach and a sex educator. And there's a difference. I mean, I think they overlap in what they do, but I think there's a difference in the approach and how they work with people.
Can you explain what that difference is?
So a sex therapist is ultimately somebody who treats sexual dysfunction, right?
Oh, okay.
So,
that's interesting. I didn't know that.
yeah. But I think it's clearly very broad what you define as sexual dysfunction, right? I mean, it could be really deep, sort of like sex addiction and stuff, or it could be, I just kind of premature
ejaculation.
I kind of just want to
Can't
last
get an
longer.
erection.
Yeah.
Can't have an orgasm. Yeah. Any of that. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. So a coach, they don't really treat dysfunction. If anything, a sex coach doesn't pathologize. It has a non-pathologizing approach, which just means that...
So it's more educative.
Correct. If somebody comes to me and they say, look, I really want to learn how to last longer. I'm having these difficulties. My approach is not to say, okay, it's a problem. Now let's go back into your past and tell me about your childhood and all of that stuff, because that's quite a typical sex therapist approach as well. So sex therapist approach is rooted more in the past to add insight into what the present situation is. Whereas coaching approach is much more present and future oriented. I might ask a little bit about what was your sex education like growing up? How did you learn to masturbate? Things that might be relevant.
But you're probably looking more at the mind, the body and the soul as well, looking at it holistically rather than just from the functional point of view.
Yeah. I think it's because it's non-pathologizing, it means that I just don't assume that, okay, this is a problem. For me, with coaching, the way that I see it, it's more like helping people reach their goals in their sex life or giving people a little bit more assistance with their sex life. A lot of coaching is educational for me. It's so much sex education. And then usually it's much more actively involved as well than therapy. So for example, I'm a big fan of giving people homework, so things that, they can work on, and then they come back.
Masturbate 3 times this week and then come back and let me know how you went.
But I also take a much more active role in terms of look, do you want to go to a sex toy store together? Shop for something together. I can explain to you everything that's on there,
Yeah, because someone who's never been in one or doesn't know anything about it would just be overwhelmed and not even know where to start.
Exactly.
Yeah.
As a coach, I feel like it's a slightly different approach, and it's more like life coaching for your sex life.
Yeah, that's lovely. That's such a nice way to put it. That's great.
I feel like I'm really on their team, and I'm not here to sort of diagnose some kind of problem. I'm here to just lend a little help and lend a little guidance.
Oh, that's beautiful. Sarah, if people want to get in touch with you for coaching or advice or just
listen to the podcast.
Listen to the podcast. How can they get in touch with you?
All right. Well, the easiest way is to go to my website, sarasense.com, and just drop me a line there.
Do you want to spell that?
Yeah. It's Sara, S-A-R-A, no H, and then Sense, S-E-N-S-E. So it's all one word, sarasense.com. And you can just drop me a line, and you can also leave me a review on my podcast. You know, we like
Could you leave a review for me too while you're there?
Exactly.
Do 2 reviews.
Leave a review.
Hong Kong Confidential.
Leave
sort
a
it
review
out.
for Jules as well.
Leave a review for Sarah as well. I'm going to go back and listen to episode 9 of yours.
Yeah.
Definitely. I'm really keen to check that out.
Yeah, so
I'm very interested.
I'm available for speaking, for coaching. If you know a good guest for the podcast, send them my way. If you want to be a guest.
I've got one in mind, but I'm trying to nail them first. So when I've got them, I'll pass them to you once
Fantastic.
I've had them.
I mean, we can nail them together.
That sounds kinky. Sarah, thank you so much for meeting me today. It's been so interesting, so fascinating. And I hope that we're getting people thinking about being more comfortable talking about sex.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
And can we finish off by singing, let's talk about sex, baby. Let's talk about you and me. Let's talk about all the good things and the bad things that make me. Let's talk about sex.
Let's talk about sex.
Coast to coast.
You've got a great voice.
Oh, thank you. You do too. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Hong Kong Confidential is brought to you by Teresa's Turkish Towels. Teresa imports the finest 100% Turkish cotton towels that dry very quickly, making them perfect for Hong Kong's humid climate. Say goodbye to the traditional smelly and stinky towels and try the colourful and fresh selections available online or in Teresa's Wan Chai store. Use the promo code CONFIDENTIAL online or mention this podcast when you visit in person to receive $100 off your entire order when you order 2 or more towels. With 100% satisfaction guaranteed or your money back, the only thing you've got to lose are the musty smells that permeate traditional terry towels. Visit www.hkturkish.com in order to get the address and directions to Teresa's semi-hidden location. So that brings us to the end of another Hong Kong Confidential podcast. I'm Jules Hannaford. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you'll be with me again next week. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please can you go to iTunes to rate and review it. I would really appreciate your feedback. You can email me at jules@hongkongconfidential.net, and you can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Hong Kong Confidential. If you'd like to hit me up on Twitter, it's at Jules Hannaford. I would love to hear from you.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.